10 Scary True Cabin Horror Stories. Story number 1, The Whispering Pines. It was the solitude I sought when I rented the cabin. The city had become too suffocating, its noise and people overwhelming my thoughts. I was a writer, one whose creativity seemed drained by the endless distractions of urban life. The cabin, a small structure tucked away deep in the woods, promised the peace I craved. I thought the quiet would be my salvation, a place to finish my novel without interruption. From the very first night, the atmosphere felt wrong. The cabin was well kept but old, creaking in the night like a living thing. The walls seemed to breathe, sighing with each gust of wind. But it was the forest around me that disturbed me most. The trees towered high, their limbs twisting and gnarled as though they had witnessed centuries of secrets. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and when night fell, the silence seemed to swallow all sound, leaving me in a void of unnatural quiet. The first night passed without incident, but as I sat by the fireplace the following day, working on my manuscript, I heard something that chilled me. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was something different about it, a faint whisper carried on the breeze. I ignored it at first, chalking it up to my imagination, worn thin from the isolation. But as the hours passed, the whispers returned, louder this time. I tried to concentrate on my writing, but the voices gnawed at the edges of my mind. They were not in any language I could recognize. Ancient, guttural, unintelligible. They didn't seem to come from any one place. Instead, they moved with the wind, swirling around me in a maddening chorus. I closed the windows, thinking that would shut them out, but it did no good. The whispers remained, growing louder as night fell. That night, I lay in bed, the darkness pressing against the walls. I wanted to sleep, to escape the relentless murmurs, but sleep never came. The voices continued, rising in intensity like a chant or some kind of incantation. And though I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, just the trees groaning under their own weight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The trees, the very forest around me, seemed to grow more oppressive with each passing hour, closing in on the cabin like a trap. The next day, driven by a mixture of curiosity and dread, I ventured into the woods. I hoped to find some rational explanation for the sounds, perhaps an animal, or the shifting of branches in the wind. But as I walked deeper into the forest, the whispers seemed to follow me. They slithered through the trees, taunting, echoing, growing more urgent. I could feel their weight on my chest, pressing in on me. And then I found it. Half buried beneath the roots of an ancient oak, I uncovered a small, weathered journal. The cover was cracked and worn, its pages yellowed with age. I brought it back to the cabin, trembling with anticipation. As I began to read, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The journal had been written by a man who had stayed in this very cabin many years before. His words were frantic, the ink smeared in places, as though he had written in haste. He spoke of an ancient ritual performed in these very woods, an unspeakable rite designed to summon an entity, something not of this world. The ritual had been conducted by a group of people long forgotten, and their actions had awakened something that should never have been disturbed. As I read on, the journal detailed the horrors they had summoned. An unseen force that whispered in an ancient language, a being whose existence transcended time and space. The forest, it seemed, was not just a place. It was a gateway, a nexus that allowed this entity to bleed into our world. The ritual had been an offering, a means of binding the creature to this place, but the journal's author warned that the bindings were weakening. The forest itself, the trees, the land, were alive, aware, and hungry for the return of what had been locked away. The journal's final entry sent a surge of cold fear through me. The man had written that the whispers would grow louder until the forest could claim the soul of anyone who stayed too long. The trees would watch, they would wait, and when the time came, they would call forth the entity to feed. I looked around the cabin, suddenly aware of the weight of the silence pressing against the walls. The whispers had stopped for now, but I knew they would return. I could hear them in my mind, the soft murmurs, the shifting voices that seemed to surround me. The night outside never truly ended. There was no escape from the forest, no way to outrun the curse that had claimed those who had come before me. I knew, with growing horror, that I was not alone. The trees were watching, and something far older, far darker than I could understand was waiting for the right moment to emerge. And I, fool that I was, had come to the very place where it all began. Story number 2. The Obelisk of Eldritch Hollow. I had always believed that the pull of nature was soothing, a way to escape the relentless clamor of everyday life. So when a group of my friends and I decided to spend the weekend in an isolated cabin near Eldritch Hollow, we expected nothing more than a few days of quiet relaxation. The cabin was small, tucked away on the edge of a vast, dark forest, and seemed perfect for our retreat. The first day passed peacefully enough. We spent our time hiking, fishing, and drinking around the campfire, enjoying the silence and the crisp air of the woods. But even in that first night, a strange sense of unease began to creep in. There was something unnatural about the forest, something that lingered in the shadows, just beyond the edge of sight. I brushed it off as fatigue, but I wasn't the only one who felt it. That evening, after we had all retired to our rooms, I was the first to notice it. The soft rustling outside the cabin's thin walls wasn't the wind, it was movement. Something large, something watching. I wasn't brave enough to go outside and investigate, so I stayed in bed, my thoughts spiraling as the sounds grew louder, almost as though they were circling the cabin. In the morning, I mentioned it to the others, but they dismissed it. "It's probably just animals," my friend Darren said with a chuckle, trying to downplay the situation. And for the rest of the day, everything seemed normal. But as the second night fell, the whispers began. They were faint at first, like distant voices carried on the wind, but they seemed to grow stronger as the hours passed. At first, we assumed it was our minds playing tricks on us, but when the shadows around the cabin began to seem more solid, more purposeful, we couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. That's when we learned about the obelisk. It was Darren who found the journal. He'd ventured into the woods earlier that day, straying farther than any of us had dared, and came across an old, forgotten structure deep within the trees. A large, black obelisk, standing alone in a clearing, carved with strange, indecipherable symbols. The markings were nothing like anything he had seen before, their shapes twisted and contorted, as if they had been etched by hands not meant for such tasks. The very sight of the obelisk left him shaken, an unsettling weight pressing down on him as though the forest itself had grown hostile. But it was the journal he discovered in a hollowed-out log nearby that truly set the course of our doom. The journal had belonged to a man who had stayed in the cabin before us, and his writings were filled with frantic desperation. His words were scrawled hastily, as if he were constantly in a rush to escape something, yet too terrified to leave. As we read his accounts, we learned that the obelisk was not simply a relic of forgotten history. It was an altar, a monument to an elder god, an ancient being that had once ruled the earth and demanded sacrifices to remain dormant. The journal detailed how the obelisk had been created, its connection to the forest, and the dark rituals performed by those who had come before us. The forest, it seemed, was not just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, and the obelisk was its heart, the focal point where the god's power could be tapped. The whispers we had heard were the voices of those who had been consumed by the entity, trapped between this world and the next, forever calling to those who would listen. The god's hunger had awakened once more, and we had unknowingly disturbed it. As we read, a cold dread settled in our bones. The more we read, the more we realized that the presence in the woods was no mere figment of our imagination. The forest was alive. It had watched us from the moment we arrived, and now it was calling us. The dreams we had been experiencing, the nightmares that had plagued us in the dead of night, were not merely the product of an overactive mind. They were visions, messages from the elder god itself, urging us toward the obelisk, where the final ritual would soon take place. It was then that the true horror of our situation became clear. We had awakened the god, and now there would be no escaping it. The shadows around the cabin grew longer and more oppressive. The figures we had seen watching us were no longer just in the corners of our eyes. They were closing in, their forms beginning to take shape, appearing in the darkness outside the cabin. We could hear the scraping of something against the wood, the slow, deliberate movement of something far older than us, far more terrible. And then we knew. The god was here, and it would not let us leave. In the end, we were no longer in control of our fates. We had been drawn into the forest's web, and it was only a matter of time before we would be consumed. Our lives nothing more than another offering to satisfy the hunger of something that could never be sated. We had trespassed into Eldritch Hollow, and now we were trapped forever. The journal had warned us, but it was too late. The whispers had become shouts. The trees had come alive, and the obelisk's power had risen to claim us all. I am the last one left, and the shadows are closing in on me now. I hear the whispers growing louder, calling my name, urging me to the clearing. Soon, I too will join the others in the forest, trapped forever beneath the gaze of the elder god. And perhaps, in time, the next fools who wander into this hollow will find the journal, and the cycle will begin again. Story number 3, The Forgotten One. It was meant to be the perfect getaway, a quiet, secluded retreat in the woods where my wife, Emily, and I could escape the pressures of everyday life. We were a young couple, eager for privacy, and the idea of renting a cabin far from the noise and distractions of the city seemed like the perfect way to reconnect. The cabin, nestled deep in the forest, was isolated but charming, and the price was far more reasonable than any other vacation rental we'd found. The owner of the cabin was said to have been a reclusive hermit who lived alone for years. He had disappeared mysteriously, leaving the cabin abandoned and untouched for some time. The thought of it being so secluded, so distant from the world, only added to its appeal. We had no concerns about the stories surrounding the hermit. In fact, we were excited by the idea of having the entire place to ourselves, with no one around for miles. When we arrived, the cabin looked as though it had been left in a hurry. Dust covered the floors, and the air was thick with the scent of wood and mildew. The windows, covered in grime, barely let in the light, but it was cozy in a way that made us feel at home. We spent the first day unpacking and settling in, but as the night drew closer, I began to sense something off. It was a strange feeling that crept over me, like the air itself was heavy with history, something forgotten, buried, and unwilling to be remembered. The next morning, I was the first to explore the cabin more thoroughly. I came across strange symbols carved into the walls and floors, hidden in corners where I hadn't noticed them before. At first, I thought they were just odd marks, nothing more than the whims of the eccentric hermit. But as I studied them, a chill ran through me. They weren't random scribbles. These symbols were deliberate, intricate, and deeply unsettling. They seemed almost alive, their curves twisting in ways that defied logic. When I showed Emily, she laughed it off. "It's probably just some weird hobby of the hermits," she said, not as bothered by them as I was. But as the day went on, the feeling of unease continued to grow. The house itself seemed to watch us, as though something unseen was observing our every move. That evening, after dinner, we decided to explore the basement. The stairs creaked under our weight as we descended into the dark, and the air grew cooler the deeper we went. The basement was dank and smelled of earth and decay, but something else lingered there, something ancient and forgotten. As I reached the bottom, I felt a sudden shiver, a cold sensation that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Then we saw it. On the far wall of the basement, there were several large, old paintings. They were hung haphazardly, their frames crooked and their colors faded. But it was the figures in the paintings that sent a wave of nausea through me. The paintings depicted a being, half human, half monster, whose eyes were disturbingly lifelike. They seemed to follow us as we moved around the room, their gaze fixed on us no matter where we stood. The being in the paintings was twisted, its features a grotesque blend of human and something far darker. The shape of its body was both human and monstrous, and its expression was filled with an unnatural hunger. It was as if it had been waiting for us, waiting for someone to come. As Emily and I stood there, staring at the paintings in disbelief, we noticed something even more chilling. On the walls around the paintings, more symbols had been carved. Symbols like those I had seen earlier in the cabin. But these were different. These seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and as I ran my fingers along them, they felt warm to the touch. It was as if the symbols themselves were alive, reacting to our presence. That was when it hit me. This wasn't just a cabin. It wasn't just the eccentric hermit's home. The symbols, the paintings, the strange presence in the air, it all pointed to something much darker. Something had been here long before us, and whatever it was, it had never left. The next few days passed in a blur. We tried to go about our stay as normal, but the strange feelings grew stronger, more oppressive. The paintings in the basement haunted my every thought. I began to see the figure in them even when I wasn't near the basement. Its eyes, always watching. And the whispers. They started after the third night. At first, I thought I was hearing things. Soft, almost inaudible whispers that seemed to drift through the walls. But soon, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, and they were no longer coming from the walls. They came from the very air around us. Emily, too, was growing disturbed. She woke up one night, her eyes wide with terror, and claimed she had seen something. Something in the shadows outside the window. She said it had been watching her, just like the figure in the paintings. At first, I thought she was imagining it, but when I looked outside, there was nothing. Just the forest, dark and still. But as the days passed, I realized that the whispers weren't just in our minds. They were real, and they were calling us to the basement. They urged us to look closer at the paintings, to understand the entity they depicted. And when we finally gave in, when we dared to approach the basement once more, we knew we had awakened something we were never meant to disturb. The being in the paintings had not been an artist's creation. It was a presence, an entity, and it had been bound to the cabin, bound to the land for centuries. Its slumber had been disturbed the moment we set foot in the cabin. Now, it was stirring, rising from the depths of time, and it would not rest until it had finished what it had started long ago. The woods around the cabin grew darker, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. We tried to leave, but the forest would not let us. It seemed to close in around us, its paths twisting and turning until we were lost. unable to find our way out. The figure in the paintings was no longer just a picture. It had become something real, something that reached out from the canvas, its eyes always watching, its hunger growing. And now, as I write this, I know we are not alone. The Forgotten One is awake, and it has come for us. We were never meant to find it. Story number 4. The Shadows Beneath the Floorboards. I had never planned on coming to this cabin. The events that led me here were far too personal, far too painful to recount. But after everything that had happened, after the loss, I couldn't stay in the city any longer. I needed solitude, space to think, to try and find some kind of peace, even if it was temporary. The cabin was remote, tucked away in a forest far from the noise of civilization. It was perfect for what I needed. The first day passed quietly. The cabin, though old, was cozy, and the air was fresh and clean. It wasn't much, but it was enough for me to begin the healing process. The quiet of the place seemed to soothe the rawness of my emotions. It was as if time itself had slowed down here. The sun dipped early, as it often does in the dense woods, and by nightfall the silence grew profound, almost oppressive. That's when I started hearing it. At first, it was faint, a soft creaking, like the house settling. I didn't think much of it. The floorboards, aged and warped by years of neglect, naturally made odd sounds. But as the night deepened, the creaking grew more deliberate. It wasn't just the house. It felt like something was moving beneath the floor, shifting, dragging, scratching at the wood. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just an old house with its own quirks. But sleep didn't come easily. The sound only grew louder, more distinct, as though something, or someone, was trying to escape from underneath the floor. My heart pounded in my chest, but I stayed still, trying to dismiss it as my mind playing tricks on me. Then came the whispers. At first, it was just the wind, or so I thought. But as I lay in bed, trying to ignore the sounds, I heard the faintest of voices. They were soft, guttural, as though they were coming from deep within the earth itself. The words were unintelligible, a language foreign and ancient, but there was no mistaking the intention behind them, an urgency, a demand. The whispers called to me. Unable to ignore it any longer, I rose from bed and approached the floorboards. The sounds were louder now, closer. The wood groaned, and I could feel the floor shift under my feet as if something was pushing from below. My curiosity, mixed with a growing sense of dread, propelled me to pry up a few of the loose boards. The air beneath was thick and stale, a musty odor rising from the gap. I crouched low, peering into the crawlspace below. There, in the dim light, I saw it. A passageway, narrow and winding, sloping downward into darkness. But what caught my eye was what lay just within reach. Scraps of fabric, torn pieces of old parchment, and a set of tattered, rusted implements. As I reached out to investigate further, a chill ran through me. The whispering voices had stopped, but now, a heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the faint echo of my own breath. I had heard of places where terrible things had been hidden, things buried beneath the earth to be forgotten. But I never imagined I'd stumble upon something like this, something so ancient, so wrong. The crawlspace was no mere storage area. It was the remnants of something far darker. Among the broken relics, I found symbols. Symbols etched into the stone walls and carved into the floor in a language I couldn't comprehend. The air grew colder, as though the temperature itself was being drained from the room, and a sense of dread washed over me. I began to piece together what had happened in this place long ago. The objects, the symbols, they all pointed to something unholy, A cult had once gathered here, their rites dark and forbidden. The very ground beneath me seemed to have been stained by their practices. These people, in their twisted rituals, had called something from beyond, something that should never have been summoned. And now, their last vengeful spirit was trapped beneath this cabin, bound to the earth by its own evil. It was then that I realized the terrible truth. The spirit had been waiting all this time, waiting for someone to disturb its slumber. And my presence in this cabin, my very disturbance of the floorboards, had awakened it. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer peaceful, no longer still. It was heavy, filled with a palpable malice, and I could feel the air grow thick, almost suffocating. I heard it then, the unmistakable sound of something moving beneath the floor, closer this time. It wasn't the house settling. It was something reaching for me. I turned and ran, but the door wouldn't open. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. The floorboards themselves seemed to shift and groan as if they were alive, blocking my path. The whispers returned, louder now, their words clear and desperate. "Join us," they said. "Become one with us." I don't know how much time passed as I struggled to break free. Every step I took felt like I was walking deeper into the earth. The house was no longer just a house. It had become a living thing, its very foundations twisted and alive with the malevolent spirit that had been trapped here for so long. As I write this now, I can hear the whispers again. They've grown louder, and the floorboards beneath me tremble with the weight of something ancient and vengeful. I know what must happen next. The cult, its spirit, its eternal hunger, they will not be denied. I will join them, as all those who came before me have, and the cycle will continue. Something dark has been awakened, and now it seeks its final sacrifice. I will be its next. Story number 5. The Last of the Watchers. I had spent years searching for something that most people believed to be nothing more than a myth. A long-lost civilization, hidden deep in the wilderness, untouched by time. But my studies had led me here, to a forgotten ruin near an isolated cabin, tucked away in the dense forests of the north. No one had set foot here in centuries, and that fact intrigued me more than I could explain. I thought it would be the discovery of a lifetime. But what I found there, what I uncovered, changed me in ways I could never have imagined. The cabin itself was small and weathered, its wood dark and rotted from years of exposure. It sat on the edge of the ruins like a sentinel, guarding the secrets buried beneath it. I was hesitant to stay at first, but the closest village was miles away, and the ruins promised to reveal more about the civilization I had been studying for so long. I convinced myself it would be temporary. A few nights, a brief respite before I returned to the excavation. But as the days passed, I found myself drawn deeper into the history of the place, unable to tear myself away. It was in the cabin's attic that I found the journal. Its cover was brittle with age, and the pages were yellowed and fragile, the ink faded but still legible. The journal had been written by a man who had lived in this cabin long ago, someone who had come to study the very same ruins I was now exploring. His words were frantic, filled with a growing sense of dread, and as I read through the entries, I realized that I was uncovering something far darker than I had ever anticipated. The journal spoke of a group of beings called the Watchers. They were not human, but something older, something incomprehensible, who had silently observed the rise and fall of civilizations for millennia. They had watched humanity from the shadows, never intervening, never participating, but always present, always witnessing. The author of the journal had been drawn to them, compelled by a need to understand their nature, their purpose. But what he uncovered was a truth far more disturbing. The Watchers were not merely passive observers, as I had initially thought. They had been imprisoned here, on this very land, for crimes that were unspeakable, a punishment for their sins against the universe itself. They had once been powerful beings, capable of bending reality, but they had overstepped their bounds. They had tampered with forces beyond their comprehension, delved too deeply into the fabric of existence, and in doing so, had awakened something terrible. And for their transgressions, they were bound to this place, cursed to watch over the world, unable to intervene or escape. As I read on, the journal grew more erratic, the author's handwriting jagged and desperate. He spoke of strange occurrences, of figures moving in the shadows, of whispers on the wind, of a growing sense of oppression that seemed to fill the cabin itself. He wrote of the Watcher's return, a return that was imminent, a return that would mark the end of the world as we knew it. The ruin I was studying, he claimed, was not just a monument to a forgotten civilization. It was a prison, a place where the Watchers had been bound, and the time was fast approaching when they would be free. I had to know more. I couldn't stop myself. The journal spoke of hidden passages beneath the ruins, tunnels that led deep into the earth, to places where the Watchers had once been kept. As I explored the ruins further, I began to find evidence of their presence. Strange carvings on the walls, symbols that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking, as though they were alive. And the air, thick with the scent of decay, began to feel heavier, as though something was pressing down on me, watching me. I ventured into the tunnels beneath the ruins, following the path the journal described. The deeper I went, the more the oppressive feeling grew, as though the earth itself was alive, aware of my presence. The walls were lined with more of those symbols, and the further I descended, the more I felt the weight of the Watcher's gaze upon me. I could hear whispers, faint and indistinct, like a voice just out of reach, calling me deeper into the darkness. At the very heart of the tunnels, I found what I had been searching for. A large chamber, the walls carved with ancient symbols, the floor covered in dust and debris. But in the center of the room, there was a stone pedestal, and upon it, an object that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. It was a crystal, dark and translucent, its surface swirling with shadow. And as I gazed upon it, I realized the horrible truth. The Watchers were not merely imprisoned in this place. They had been bound to the crystal, their essence trapped within it, waiting for the moment when they would be free. The moment I touched the crystal, a terrible force exploded within me. I felt the air around me crackle with energy, and the whispers became shouts, screams that reverberated through my very soul. I saw visions, visions of the Watchers, not as the passive observers I had imagined, but as monstrous beings, their forms shifting and contorting, their eyes burning with ancient malice. And I understood then, with a clarity that chilled me to the bone, that the Watchers had never been meant to observe. They had been the architects of horrors beyond imagination, the creators of unspeakable chaos. I dropped the crystal, but it was too late. The ground shook, the walls trembled, and I knew in that moment that I had not only awakened the Watchers, I had set them free. The ruins around me began to crumble, the very earth splitting open as if in response to their release. The cabin, the journal, the land itself, all of it was a part of their prison, and now their return had begun. I fled, but I knew there was no escape. The Watchers were free, and they would reclaim the world they had once lost. As I run through the forest, I can feel their presence behind me, in the shadows, watching every move I make. I am the last of the humans to have discovered their existence, and now I am marked. Their return has begun, and there is no place left to hide. I write this as a warning to anyone who might stumble upon this journal, this ruin, this cabin. The Watchers are awake, and they are coming for all of us. Story number 6, The Echoing Gasp. The cabin sat in a remote part of the forest, a place where the trees were thick, and the wind seemed to always carry the scent of something ancient and decayed. I had come to the area to find peace, or perhaps to escape something, though I couldn't name it. My name is Alan, and I was a young man eager for adventure, so when I stumbled upon the cabin, I saw it as a perfect retreat, far away from the pressures of the world. The old woman who lived in the cabin was a strange figure. I had met her only a few days after my arrival. She was frail and bent with age, her eyes clouded with time, but there was something about her that made me uneasy. Her warnings came shortly after we exchanged pleasantries, a cryptic advice that I brushed aside, thinking it was nothing more than an old woman's superstitions. She told me not to go near the caves, those dark, jagged openings hidden deep in the forest. "The caves are not for your kind," she said, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Things are buried there, things you should never disturb." I had laughed it off, politely nodding as if humoring a madwoman. But I had never been one to shy away from mystery, and the caves, dark and mysterious, called to me. One evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon, I could not resist the pull any longer. The forest was quiet, the air still, and the cabin behind me seemed to breathe with its own pulse as I set off in search of the caves. The trees loomed tall and oppressive around me, and the silence deepened, making the woods feel like a forgotten world. My only company was the faint echo of the old woman's warnings, but they grew distant in my mind, overshadowed by my curiosity. The entrance to the cave was barely noticeable, a jagged crack in the earth between two large boulders. The air around it was thick, heavy, as though the cave itself exhaled a stale, ancient breath. I stepped inside, and the darkness swallowed me whole. My lantern's light barely pushed back the shadows, and I felt the weight of centuries pressing down on me as I ventured deeper. The cave twisted, winding its way downward, and the temperature dropped with every step. I could hear the faintest of sounds, like whispers carried on the wind, though the air was still. Then, as I rounded a bend, I stumbled upon it. In a wide cavern, half buried beneath the dirt and rock, lay an altar, ancient and weathered, its surface carved with symbols I could not understand. The stone was covered in cracks, some of which seemed to pulse faintly, as if the very structure of the altar were alive. The air around it was thick with a presence, an ancient, forgotten weight. My heart raced, and a sense of dread gripped me, but I could not tear my eyes away. At first, I thought it was merely a relic, a forgotten marker of some ancient cult or civilization long gone. But then, I saw it. In the shadows beneath the altar, something shifted. The remnants of bones, the broken remnants of a once horrible form, still lingered in the dark. The creature, whatever it had been, was long gone, but its presence remained, a lingering echo of what had once been bound to this place. A horrible realization crept over me. This was no ordinary altar. It had been a prison, a place where something terrible had been sealed away for eternity. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in terror. The air grew colder, the darkness deeper, and I could feel the presence of something ancient stirring, as though it had sensed me, sensed the breaking of its forgotten chains. But before I could react, before I could run, a sharp, bone-chilling scream echoed through the cave, and I was flooded with a sensation of absolute, inescapable dread. I fled. I ran through the cave, stumbling, terrified, the echo of the scream still ringing in my ears, growing louder and more intense with every step I took. I don't know how I made it back to the cabin, but when I finally did, I was out of breath and shaking, my mind reeling from what I had seen. from the horror that had been unleashed. But the worst was yet to come. The cabin was empty. The old woman was gone, her belongings untouched, her presence inexplicably missing. The place felt hollow, as if the very air had been drained of its warmth. The house, once familiar, now seemed strange, unfamiliar. I stood there, frozen, when I heard it. A distant scream echoing through the woods. It was her voice. I was sure of it. But it was no longer the soft, trembling voice I had heard during our conversations. It was filled with agony, a never-ending scream that pierced the stillness of the night. The sound came from deep in the forest, far beyond the cabin, carried by the wind. It was the sound of something trapped, something calling out for release. And as I listened, I realized with horror that the old woman was no longer herself. She had become part of the creature's prison, trapped in an eternal scream, her soul forever entwined with the suffering of the thing that had been released. I could hear the scream in my mind now, not just outside the cabin. It was in my thoughts, in my chest, echoing with the agony of the creature's return. And I knew as the night stretched on that there was no escape from the horror I had unleashed. The caves had not only held a creature, they had held a curse that would follow me forever. The echoes of that scream will never stop. Story number 7. The entity in the mirror. We needed to leave. That much was clear. After the events that had torn apart our family, the only thing we could do was escape. We fled to the mountains, to a small cabin far from the prying eyes of the world. It was isolated, quiet, and the perfect place to start over, or so we thought. The cabin was old, its timbers worn by years of exposure to the harsh mountain winds, but it had a certain charm. The rooms were small and simple, with creaky floors and a smell of dust in the air. My wife, Emily, and I thought it would be enough to begin the healing process, to find some semblance of peace. Our daughter, Lily, was quiet, her innocence still untouched by the horrors of our past. We moved in, hoping that time and distance could erase the weight that clung to us. It was in the attic that I first saw it. I was exploring the dusty corners of the house, sorting through boxes of forgotten items when I came across an old mirror. It was large and ornate, framed in dark wood that was intricately carved with designs I couldn't quite make out. The glass, though old, was still clear, and it seemed almost out of place in the otherwise worn-down attic. Something about it caught my eye. I couldn't explain why, but I decided to bring it downstairs, thinking it might help make the cabin feel more like a home. At first, it was just a mirror. We hung it in the hallway, facing the darkened corner of the room. But soon, I began to notice something strange. It wasn't just the reflection of the room that I saw. Sometimes, when I passed by it late at night, the reflection was different. I would catch glimpses of faces, strange, contorted faces, twisted in expressions of hatred. Eyes burned with a malevolent glow, their intensity growing with each passing day. They didn't look like anyone I knew, but they seemed familiar, as if they were part of the cabin itself, part of the land. I thought I was imagining it. At first, I convinced myself it was just stress, that the move had unsettled me more than I realized. But as time went on, the appearances grew more frequent. It wasn't just faces anymore. The mirror began to show glimpses of something else. A figure, tall and shadowed, its features obscured by darkness. The thing was large, its form shifting as if it were made of smoke, but I could feel its presence, its eyes, cold and hungry, staring at me from within the reflection. The family noticed it too. Emily was the first to speak up. "Have you seen it?" she asked one night as we sat in the living room. Her voice trembled. "The thing in the mirror. It's not just the glass. It's something else." She had seen the creature too. Lily had seen it too, though she didn't fully understand what she was seeing. She began to avoid the hallway, her small feet skittering past the mirror whenever she had to go by. At first, we tried to ignore it, but the presence in the mirror began to feel impossible to escape. The faces became more defined, the eyes more vivid. They weren't just reflections anymore. It was as if the mirror was no longer a window to our world, but a portal to something else. A twisted dimension where the creature waited, watching, hungry. The temperature around the mirror grew colder, and we started to feel its pull, as if the glass was trying to drag us in. One evening, as the night settled over the mountains, Emily and I stood in front of the mirror. The reflection was different this time. The creature, no longer a shadow, was fully visible, its form towering over us, its eyes locked on mine. It had a face, or something close to it, pale and twisted, with features that seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though they were not meant to exist in this world. Its mouth opened, revealing teeth too sharp to be human, and a low, guttural growl escaped from its throat. It didn't speak, but I could feel its voice in my mind, echoing in the corners of my thoughts. You should never have come here. Suddenly, the mirror pulsed, as if it were alive. The glass began to ripple, distorting the reflection, and the creature's gaze seemed to burn into my very soul. In that moment, I knew it wasn't just a trick of the mind. The creature was real, and it was bound to the land, to the cabin, to the mirror, and now it wanted us. The next morning, Emily was gone, vanished without a trace. The door was locked, the windows secure, no sign of a struggle, nothing to explain where she had gone. I searched the cabin, calling her name, but the only sound that answered was the echo of my voice. It was then that I heard it, the soft whisper, carried on the wind. Come to me. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest. The mirror. The creature was there, its form clear and distinct, its eyes glowing with an impossible hunger. This time, it was no longer trapped behind the glass. It was coming for me. I could feel its presence in the air, like a heavy weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. It was reaching out, its long, shadowy limbs beginning to stretch toward me from within the mirror, and then, without warning, it stepped through the glass. The cabin seemed to tremble as the creature fully manifested, its form spilling out from the mirror like liquid shadow. It was real now, a nightmare made flesh, and it was free. I ran, but the cabin, the mountains, everything around me seemed to warp. The walls bent, the ground twisted beneath my feet, and the very air seemed to pulse with dark energy. I heard Emily's voice, faint and distant, calling to me from the woods. Her scream echoed through the forest, but it was no longer her. It was the creature, its voice mimicking hers in an endless, never-ending scream. The last thing I saw before I fled into the night was the reflection of the mirror, its surface now completely blank, no longer showing anything but the empty, haunting void. The creature was waiting, and I knew that I would never escape it. The mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was the doorway to something far darker, and I had opened it. Now, the creature and its hunger would follow me, no matter where I ran. The mirror had taken Emily, and now it wanted me. Story number 8, The Storm of Madness. The storm came without warning. I had been traveling through the desolate countryside when the dark clouds gathered quickly, swallowing the sky in an impenetrable blackness. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a living creature, and the first raindrops fell, hard and heavy. I sought refuge as quickly as I could, spotting an old, abandoned cabin in the distance. It seemed to be the only shelter in miles, and with the storm raging around me, I didn't hesitate. The cabin was small and neglected, but it offered the protection I needed. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and rot. The windows were boarded up, casting the cabin in darkness, but I didn't mind. At least it was dry, and I could wait out the storm in peace. Or so I thought. As I settled in, I noticed an old journal lying on the floor near the hearth. It looked ancient, its cover cracked and weathered, and the pages yellowed with age. Something about it drew me in. Perhaps it was the isolation of the cabin, or the strange feeling in the air, but I found myself opening the journal. It had been written by the previous tenant of the cabin, a man named Enoch Walker, who had lived here alone for years. As the storm outside raged, I began to read, unaware of how much it would alter my reality. Enoch's entries started with mundane details, his life in isolation, his struggles with the harsh weather. But as the pages turned, his writing grew more erratic, filled with wild descriptions of things he had seen during storms. According to Enoch, the storms weren't natural. They were not just violent bursts of weather, but something far worse. Something living, something ancient. He wrote of strange shapes seen in the lightning, shifting figures that appeared and disappeared in the flashes of light. He spoke of voices that came from the woods, calling to him during the worst of the storms. The voices, he claimed, were not of any human origin. They were otherworldly, calling from beyond the fabric of our reality, and they whispered terrible secrets. As I read further, I began to feel a chill creep into my bones, a sense of unease that I could not shake. The storm outside was growing stronger, the wind howling like an animal in pain, rattling the walls of the cabin. Enoch's writing became even more frantic, describing how the storm seemed to be drawing closer, as if something malevolent were feeding on them. He wrote about how the storms had driven him to madness, how they twisted his thoughts and pulled at his very soul. The voices were no longer whispers. They were demands, commands, calling him to the woods, urging him to follow them into the darkness. I could feel the storm's fury through the walls of the cabin, and the more I read, the more the words seemed to reach out to me. My mind began to feel heavy, as if the very air around me was pressing in, suffocating me. The howling wind outside was not just a storm, it was a force, a living thing that wanted something from me. I could feel its presence closing in, pushing at the edges of my sanity. I tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept returning, growing louder. The voices. They were calling to me now, just as they had called to Enoch. At first, it was faint. A soft, unintelligible murmur carried on the wind. But soon, it grew clearer, more distinct. They were no longer just whispers. They were words, familiar yet foreign, speaking in a language I did not understand. The voices seemed to come from all directions, from the trees, from the very ground beneath me. They were pulling me toward them, urging me to step outside, to face whatever lay in the heart of the storm. The journal was no longer enough. I needed to know what had happened to Enoch, what had driven him to madness. As I read the final pages of his journal, I felt my own mind beginning to fray. The words blurred together, and I could no longer tell where his thoughts ended and mine began. Enoch had written of the storm's true nature, how it was a living entity, a force of cosmic terror that had existed long before humanity, and would continue to exist long after. It was feeding on him, feeding on his fear, and it would not stop until it had consumed everything. It wanted to claim him, to drag him into the depths of the storm's heart. The storm outside was deafening now, a torrent of wind and rain that seemed to tear at the cabin, as if the very world was being ripped apart. I stood, my body trembling with a mix of fear and anticipation. The voices were louder now, urgent, calling me to the woods. They were no longer distant. They were here, inside the cabin, filling my mind with thoughts that were not my own. The storm was not just a weather phenomenon, it was an ancient entity and it was hungry. I knew what I had to do. The door to the cabin creaked open and I stepped into the storm. The wind whipped at my face, cold and biting, as the rain lashed against my skin. But I didn't care. I could feel the storm's presence like an electric current in the air tugging at my very soul. The trees swayed violently, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the ground beneath me seemed to shift, pulling me deeper into the forest. I had to follow the voices. As I walked deeper into the woods, I could hear the storm behind me, its fury growing louder, its rage rising to a maddening crescendo. The air grew thick, suffocating, and I knew I was no longer alone. The storm was with me now, a presence, an entity that had been waiting for me all along. It wanted me, just as it had wanted Enoch. And soon, it would have me. The last thing I remember before I lost myself completely was the howl of the wind, echoing through the trees like a chorus of voices. And then, everything went dark. I have no memory of how long I've been lost in the storm. Perhaps it has been days, or perhaps it has only been moments. But I know this much. The storm is not just weather. It is alive, and it is coming for me. The madness is here, and it will not let me go. Story number 9. The Cabin of the Black Sun. I had been hiking through the wilderness for days, seeking solitude and escape from the chaos of the world. The mountains, untouched and raw, seemed like the perfect place to clear my mind. The air was fresh, and the sound of my boots crunching on the forest floor was the only noise that broke the silence. But on the third day of my trek, I found something that would shatter the calm and plunge me into a nightmare. I was following a narrow trail when I stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin. It sat alone in a clearing, surrounded by dense trees that had grown tall and close. The cabin was weathered, its wood dark and cracked from years of exposure to the elements. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong in the natural world around it. Yet, I was weary from my hike, and the storm clouds that had been gathering above seemed to promise rain. I decided to take shelter inside. The door creaked open as I stepped into the cabin. The interior was dim, lit only by a few rays of fading daylight that filtered through the cracks in the walls. As I looked around, my eyes were immediately drawn to the strange carvings on the walls. Symbols, intricate and alien, were etched deep into the wood. They pulsed with a dark energy that seemed to vibrate in the air. I could almost hear them, like whispers just on the edge of hearing, calling to me. The symbols twisted and spiraled, their shapes unnatural, as if they were alive, shifting when I wasn't looking directly at them. I couldn't tear my gaze away, even as my mind screamed at me to leave. There was something captivating about them, something that made my heart race. The cabin's air felt thick, heavy with a presence I couldn't quite understand. As the day faded into night, I knew I had to investigate further. I found a small table in the corner, covered in dust and debris. On it lay an old journal, its pages yellowed with age. I opened it, hoping to find some explanation for the carvings, for the eerie feeling that had settled over me. The journal's pages were filled with rambling entries, written in a hurried, panicked hand. The writer spoke of strange occurrences in the wilderness, of a dark force that had haunted the area for centuries. He wrote about the cabin being a focal point, a place where the veil between our world and something far darker grew thin. He described an ancient, unseen force, something beyond human comprehension, that had once ruled the earth. This force had been banished long ago, but the cabin had been built upon the site where it had been sealed. The writer warned that the force would return, that it would rise again when the time was right. I read in disbelief, my hands trembling as I turned the pages. The storm outside had begun to intensify, and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. But as I read, I felt the air around me grow colder, heavier. The symbols on the walls seemed to shimmer in the dim light, their shapes becoming more vivid, as if they were alive, waiting. It was then that I realized the terrible truth. The eclipse was coming. I had heard of an eclipse that would occur only once in a lifetime, a rare event that would plunge the world into darkness. The journal spoke of it, of how the black sun would mark the return of the ancient forces that had once ruled. It was happening tonight. The cabin, this place, was the key. The darkness had begun to rise again. I rushed to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The sky above had grown unnaturally dark. The stars had vanished, and the clouds churned like an endless storm. A sickening feeling washed over me as I saw the moon slowly begin to cover the sun, plunging the world into an eerie twilight. The eclipse was upon us, and that's when it began. The world around me seemed to warp, the air thickening with a pressure I could not explain. The walls of the cabin seemed to shift, elongating and contracting like a breathing, living thing. My vision blurred, and the once dim room now seemed to glow with an unnatural light, a cold, pale light that seemed to come from within the symbols on the walls. I staggered back, dizzy and disoriented, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. I saw visions, terrifying, nightmarish glimpses of a world that had never been, yet somehow felt all too real. I saw humanity, broken and subjugated by ancient, unseen forces. Massive, otherworldly beings towered over cities, their eyes burning with malevolent power. The air was thick with the cries of the oppressed, the sky darkened by the shadows of creatures that should not exist. I saw the earth itself bending under the weight of these forces, its surface twisted and broken, a world suffocated by the dark powers that had once ruled. The visions grew more intense, and I could feel the cabin shaking as though it were about to be torn apart. The dark force, the ancient power that had been banished, was awakening. It was here, inside the cabin, and it was pulling me into its nightmarish realm. I tried to flee, to run, but the door wouldn't open. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the symbols on the walls glowed brighter, more intense, as if they were feeding on my fear. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive darkness that had consumed the cabin. I could feel it now, the presence of the ancient being, watching me from beyond the veil. And then, as the black sun reached its peak, the force took me. My vision spun, and the world around me twisted into something unrecognizable. I was no longer in the cabin. I was in that twisted, nightmarish world, surrounded by creatures and horrors beyond understanding. The last thing I remember was the voice, low, deep, and ancient, whispering to me as everything faded to black. Welcome home. Story number 10. The Hollow in the Wood. We had heard the stories before we arrived. The locals whispered of strange disappearances, of people who ventured into the woods and were never seen again. But we were young, eager for adventure, and the cabin we rented seemed the perfect getaway. It was isolated, tucked away on the edge of a dense, untamed forest, and we didn't mind the eerie tales. It was just a forest after all, and the stories we thought were nothing more than superstition. There were 5 of us: myself, Dave, Mark, Sarah, and Emily. We had all known each other since college, and this trip was meant to be a break from the pressures of life. We spent the first couple of days hiking, fishing, and drinking around the campfire, enjoying the peace and quiet of the remote wilderness. But as the days passed, something about the forest began to unsettle us. The trees were too thick, the shadows too long, and a strange, almost palpable sense of isolation seemed to settle over the cabin every night. On the 3rd evening, we were sitting around the fire when Dave, ever the wanderer, announced that he was going to explore the woods a bit further. It was a decision that would change everything. "Just a quick hike," he said with a grin. "I'll be back in an hour tops." But an hour passed, then 2. The sun set, and the darkness of the forest seemed to close in. We called for him, but the only answer was the wind rustling through the trees. Concern began to seep in, but we tried to brush it off as nothing. It was a forest after all, and it wasn't unusual for someone to lose track of time. But when the clock hit midnight and Dave still hadn't returned, panic set in. We gathered flashlights and ventured into the woods, calling his name as we searched the dark expanse. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, and the deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. The usual sounds of the woods, chirping insects, rustling leaves, were gone, replaced by an unnatural stillness. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. We searched for hours, but there was no sign of Dave. No tracks, no signs of a struggle, just the oppressive quiet of the woods. Exhausted and defeated, we finally made our way back to the cabin, hoping he'd somehow made it back on his own. But he wasn't there. The next morning, we set out again, this time with a sense of dread gnawing at our minds. We retraced our steps, following the faint trail we thought we had marked the night before, but it led us deeper into the woods than we had ever gone. It was then that we found it. In the heart of the forest, we stumbled upon an unnatural hollow, a clearing in the trees unlike any we had seen. The trees around it were bent inward, their trunks curving toward the center as if to protect something within. The ground in the center was dark, a patch of soil that seemed to absorb the light around it. The air here was thick, as though something was pressing down on us. The very space seemed alive with something ancient, something wrong. As we approached the hollow, the feeling of dread intensified. My breath caught in my throat, and my limbs grew heavy, as if the forest itself was trying to keep us away. It was then that we saw it. Something shifting within the hollow, something we couldn't fully comprehend. It wasn't a figure, but a mass, a grotesque shape that seemed to bend and twist in ways that defied nature. It was as if the very fabric of reality was warping in its presence. Suddenly, the air around us was filled with whispers, low, guttural sounds that seemed to come from the earth itself. Our flashlights flickered, and in their brief flashes we saw images. Horrible visions of a creature, its form shifting like smoke, its eyes burning with an unnatural light. We saw it standing in the hollow, its twisted limbs reaching out, its mouth opening in a silent scream. It was not a creature of this world, but something far older, something that had been imprisoned here long before humanity had walked the earth. The whispers grew louder, and the visions became more vivid, as if the very earth beneath us was trying to show us the truth. The creature had been trapped here, bound by forces older than time itself. It had been waiting for centuries, for millennia, its form twisting in the dark, waiting for something, someone, to free it. I don't know how long we stood there, rooted to the spot in a trance-like state, unable to look away. But as the sun began to set, the hollow seemed to grow darker, the air colder. A feeling of urgency flooded over us, and we realized, in a sickening wave, that we had done something. We had come too close. The forest had been guarding something, keeping it locked away, and we had disturbed it. Suddenly, the ground beneath our feet seemed to tremble, and we heard something in the distance. A sound that was both a roar and a whisper, as if the forest itself was groaning in agony. The creature, whatever it was stirring. We ran. We didn't look back as we sprinted through the forest, our hearts pounding in our chests. The path seemed to stretch endlessly before us, the trees closing in, as though the forest itself was swallowing us whole. We finally made it back to the cabin, but as we slammed the door shut, we knew in the deepest part of our souls, that we had awakened something. Something that had been hidden for so long. Something that was never meant to be freed. That night, as we sat in silence, trying to calm our minds, we heard it. A sound, distant but unmistakable. Whispers. Low, guttural voices coming from the woods, calling to us. And I knew then, as I looked around at the faces of my friends, that none of us would ever leave this place. We had come too close to the hollow, and the creature within it would not let us go. The forest had claimed us, and the whispers would never stop.